Welcome back, Highlanders, to Chapter 12, where we're going to talk about some of the incentives created by this discretionary fiscal policy that we talked about in Chapter 11. We're also going to talk a little bit about some of the secondary effects of this discretionary fiscal policy that we talked about in Chapter 11. So this chapter is kind of the classical rebuttal to the Keynesian argument that we should be using discretionary fiscal policy to pull the economy out of a recession because the economy would not be able to correct itself. With that in mind, here's what we're going to be talking about this chapter. Right, we're going to be going over the classical view of fiscal policy and why it won't work out nearly as well as the Keynesians believed it would, and that's largely because of this process called crowding out. And then we'll talk about a third school of thought here, the new classical view of fiscal policy, which also says that fiscal policy will not stimulate the economy as much as people originally thought, but for a different reason known as the Ricardian equivalence. Then we'll talk about this Keynesian idea of the paradox of thrift, and again how they view this idea of people saving differently than the way that the classical economists would view the idea of people saving. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the political incentives of discretionary fiscal policy. Good economics isn't always good politics, and good politics isn't always good economics. And that's never going to ring more true than we start talking about some of the political incentives around this idea of allowing the government to decide to run budget deficits whenever they like. And then finally, we'll talk about some consensus among macroeconomists, both Keynesian and classical, so the things that Keynesian and classical economists tend to agree. So with that in mind, that's kind of where we're headed with this particular chapter. So let's get into the first part of this chapter and probably the most complicated part of it, and that is this idea of crowding out. So to frame this argument or debate, a Keynesian economist will come along and say that because the economy cannot correct itself, expansionary fiscal policy during a recession will help stimulate that aggregate demand and pull the economy out of recession. So remember, the Keynesians believe that during a recession, you want to use that expansionary fiscal policy, increase government spending, cut taxes, put more money in the hands of people, and that will help pull the economy out of a recession. And the classical economists would probably come along and say, yeah, that could possibly work, but maybe not, right? In other words, while that might be true, as it turns out, it might not be true because of this whole crowding out process. So crowding out is a reduction in private spending due to higher interest rates that are generated by budget deficits financed through government borrowing. So the classical argument here against this Keynesian prescription of using expansionary fiscal policy, in short, is that the increase in the government's desire to borrow money to fund these tax cuts while spending more is going to cause interest rates to go up. And when interest rates go up, that's going to cause the private sector to go out there and spend and invest less money. So in other words, it's just going to replace private spending with government spending. So that's kind of the idea behind this crowding out. It's not that the government spending is going to add to the economy. It's just going to replace what the private sector would have done, largely because these interest rates are going to be higher as a result of the increased demand to borrow funds from the government. So with that in mind, there's a kind of a long step-by-step process by which crowding out happens. So let's go ahead and go through that process. All right. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of crowding out. So again, this idea starts with the premise here that the government is going to conduct expansionary fiscal policy to bring the economy out of a recession, or in other words, we're going to use that Keynesian prescription here. So again, the idea is that the economy is in a recession. So this is where we'll start. And being in a recession, the government is going to use expansionary fiscal policy. And when the government uses expansionary fiscal policy, hopefully you remember from the last chapter, that means that the government is going to increase their spending and or cut taxes. Either or both of those together, as you might imagine, is going to increase the size of the budget deficit. So this increases the budget deficit, and when the budget deficit goes up, that means the government's going to have to figure out a way to pay all this money that they're spending while taking in less money in tax revenue. And the way they do that is with borrowing, right? So again, the idea here is that the budget deficit goes up. And when that budget deficit increases, then the government's going to have to borrow more. So the government borrowing more is going to increase the demand for loanable funds, and this increase in demand for loanable funds is going to increase the interest rate, right? So the demand for loanable funds is going to go up. And demand for loanable funds increases, and that's going to cause the interest rate to increase. Now, if you're wondering why the demand for loanable funds going up is going to cause the interest rate to increase, then you have to look no further than that loanable funds market. So I'm going to kind of exit the screen temporarily here so that we can take a look at what's going on in that loanable funds market. So let's go ahead and graph that out. Right, so again, I'm going to exit the full screen mode and go over here to this new slide just so we can graph this out. All right, so I'm going to review the loanable funds market in case you didn't remember from Chapter 9 what that market looks like. So remember that we have the real interest rate and we have the quantity of money being saved and invested here. Remember that you have an upward sloping supply curve, and the supply of loanable funds comes from our savings. And then we have a downward sloping demand curve. Right, remember the demand for loanable funds comes from the amount that we're willing to borrow for the purposes of investing. Right, so again, that demand curve really comes from borrowing money. And then where those two intersect, you're going to have the amount saved equal to the amount invested. And then that's going to give us an equilibrium interest rate where that happens. Right. Now, what happens if the government decides that it wants to borrow more money? Well, if the government's going to borrow more money in order to finance this increase in spending while taking in less money in tax revenues, then again, the government borrows money from these banks in the same way that you might borrow money from these banks, and that's going to increase the demand for loanable funds. So now you have the government's borrowing into all the private sector's borrowing, and so the demand to borrow that money, call that D2, right, is going to intersect that old supply curve. And where that happens, you have a new amount of money being saved and invested here. Call that QSI2. And then you have a new equilibrium interest rate. We'll call that R2 star. And that interest rate going up is kind of what we're talking about in the last slide there as the result of this increase in borrowing. So going back to this last slide, this is going to cause that interest rate to go up, right? And when that interest rate goes up, that's going to cause consumption and investment to decrease. It's also going to cause capital inflows to increase. So this increase in interest rate is going to have a two-pronged effect. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to cause people to put more money in the bank rather than go out there and spend it, right? So that consumption is going to go down. Also, people are not going to be nearly as eager to borrow money for their private purposes of investment when those interest rates are higher. So that's going to cause investment to go down. And then the second thing that this higher interest rate is going to do is not only is it going to encourage people in the United States to put more money in U.S. banks and businesses, right? But it's going to, or U.S. banks, but it's going to cause people in other countries to put money in U.S. banks, right? So if Bank of America is offering a higher interest rates on their savings account, then not only are you going to put more money in Bank of America as a U.S. citizen, but people in other countries might start putting more money in a savings account at Bank of America if those interest rates are higher than what was happening within their domestic countries. So capital inflows, which is again when people from other countries are putting money in U.S. banks, that's also going to increase. All right. Now, in order to figure out how an increase in capital inflows is going to affect us, then we need to graph that out on the foreign exchange market. So once again, I'm going to exit this full screen mode and go to that next slide so that we can graph out that change. All right, so in order to figure out how capital inflows is going to affect us, or a change in capital inflows is going to affect us, then we need to go to the foreign exchange market in order to answer this one. And again, we're going to graph that out for you It's kind of a review of those graphs in Chapter 9. Never hurts to review those a little bit more, because again, you're going to be using them throughout the class here. So remember, looking at the price of foreign currency relative to the quantity of foreign currency. Remember that you have an upward sloping supply of foreign currency. Remember where that foreign currency comes from. It comes from selling goods abroad, which we call exports. Also, when people put money in U.S. banks and businesses, which we're going to call capital inflows. We also have a downward sloping demand for foreign currency. Remember where that demand for foreign currency comes from, or why we want foreign currency. So we can buy goods from other countries, what we call imports, or so we can invest in banks and businesses abroad, what we call those capital outflows. And where those two intersect, you get that equilibrium quantity of foreign currency, call that QFC1, and equilibrium price of foreign currency, call that PFC1. And remember that when we go up the vertical axis here, then that is the foreign currency appreciating and the dollar depreciating. If we go down this vertical axis, then that is the foreign currency depreciating and the dollar appreciating. So again, make sure you can understand how to read that graph so you can understand again how these changes are going to affect our economy. So we said that we're going to have an increase in capital inflows as a result of those higher interest rates, right? So if capital inflows are going to go up, then all else constant, that's going to make the supply of foreign currency go up. And an increase in the supply of foreign currency is going to be a shift to the right of that particular curve. So call this SFC2. And where that intersects our old demand curve, that's going to give us a new quantity of foreign currency. So call that QFC2. And a new lower price for foreign currency. So call that PFC2. And when the price for foreign currency is going down, that's another way of saying that the dollar has appreciated. Right? So again, the dollar is going to be worth more relative to foreign currency as a result of this change. So again, how's that going to affect things? Let's go back to our other slide. So we know that capital inflows is going to go up, and we know that's going to cause the dollar to appreciate. Again, looking at what happens on that other graph. And again, this is kind of what macroeconomics is about, is learning how all these markets work together. Now, when the dollar appreciates, that's going to cause net exports to decline. It's not too hard to think about why. All right, remember that net exports is equal to exports minus imports. Well, if the dollar appreciates, that means that the dollar can buy euros or pesos or other foreign currencies cheaper, right? If the dollar can buy more of that foreign currency, then that means that Americans will find goods produced over in Europe relatively cheaper than they did before. So because the dollar appreciates, Americans will find goods in other countries cheaper. That means that imports are going to go up. At the same time, if you're in Europe, your euro can buy fewer of those US dollars, right? So again, the dollar appreciating is the same thing as saying that that foreign currency like the euro has depreciated. That means that they're going to find goods produced over in the United States more expensive. So people in Europe are going to be less likely to buy those US exports, so exports are going to go down. And that's going to cause our net exports to go down, right? With that in mind, it's not too hard to see why this fiscal policy is going to fail to bring the economy out of recession. Remember that equation, y is equal to c plus I plus g plus nx, right? The whole Keynesian idea is that, hey, if we raise this government spending, and if we maybe cut taxes to allow people to consume a little bit more, then that's going to increase y, and that's the whole idea. We need to boost that aggregate demand. But according to this whole crowding out idea, this increase in government spending coupled by these lower taxes is going to cause us to have to borrow more as a government. When the government borrows more, then that's going to cause these interest rates to go up. When interest rates go up, that's going to cause consumption to go down and investment to go down. So we got consumption going down and investment going down, right? We also have net exports possibly going down as a result of that dollar appreciating, which is also going to happen when the interest rates go up. So in other words, will that Y go up? Maybe, maybe not, right? If it is going to go up, it's not going to go up by nearly as much as maybe the Keynesians thought it would because of, again, this crowding out process. So that's why the classical economists might be against this idea of using this expansionary fiscal policy. It's not going to stimulate the economy nearly as much as you think because it's just going to crowd out this private spending, private investment, and those net exports. So that is the crowding out process and probably the hardest part of this particular chapter. So if you can kind of understand this process or the steps of this process, then you should be good to go. I think the rest of the chapter is actually more simple to understand. Right, so again, make sure you understand this five-step process. Ooh, didn't mean to do that. Make sure you understand this whole five-step process. And again, understand these graphs and how they work in creating this five-step process as you are going through this particular chapter, right? So again, basically what we're doing is graphing out what happens here in step 3 in this first graph, right, on the loanable funds market. And then we are graphing out what happens here in step 4 in the second graph, right? So again, make sure you understand why these effects are happening, right? So as long as you can understand why these effects are happening, and again, the graphs will help you tell you that answer, you should be able to understand this fiscal policy process, right? So again, when you're going through this whole step-by-step procedure, understand that, right, that none of these steps are particularly hard, right, to understand by themselves. Just kind of understand how they relate together, and these graphs can help you solve that. All right, so that is the idea of the classical economists as to why this expansionary fiscal policy won't work. Now let's talk a little bit about the new classical view of fiscal policy, or again, this kind of third school of thought coming along saying why they think that this discretionary fiscal policy won't work as well. So new classical economists also do not believe that expansionary fiscal policy that brings about these budget deficits will stimulate additional consumption and aggregate demand, or at least not nearly as much as those Keynesian economists think it will. But again, they think it won't work for a different reason. They don't necessarily believe in that crowding out process as much as they believe in this other thing that was going to come to known as the Ricardian equivalence. So why won't this work according to the new classical economists? Well, because people will save whatever expected future tax increase is going to be brought about as a result of this expansionary fiscal policy. So remember that idea of the permanent income hypothesis. People like to smooth their consumption cycles over time. And what we mean by that is that people don't want to go from a process where they're maybe eating out 2 or 3 times a week, every week, to a process where they're not eating out at all because, again, they've been hit hard by, say, maybe an expected future tax increase. That leaves them with less money to spend. So what people will do when the government, say, gives them more money at the same time that it cuts their taxes is people recognize that this increase in budget deficit is going to cause us to have to pay back those deficits sometime in the future. So whatever stimulus checks they get in the mail, they're probably not going to spend them. They're probably just going to save them for when the government asks for them back. In other words, people might be cautious when the government gets these stimulus checks, especially if they're having their taxes cut at the same time, because they know that's not something that is really sustainable, right? So, for example, when the government's cutting people their checks for the coronavirus stimulus, people might not necessarily go out and spend those checks right away. They might put that money in the bank because they know that these hard times are coming and that eventually the government's going to want that money back, right? So with that in mind, that's what is known as the Ricardian equivalence. It's the belief that a tax reduction financed with government debt will exert no effect on aggregate demand because people will know that those higher future taxes are coming, so they're just going to save that money rather than spend it. Right, so the first few steps are the same in terms of how this Ricardian equivalence works. If we're in a recession, the government's going to be using this expansionary fiscal policy to hopefully pull us out of that recession according to the Keynesian prescription. Again, that means the government is going to be spending more money at the same time that's taxing us less, right? And the government needs to finance that. And one way they're going to finance that is through an increase in borrowing. So yeah, let's go ahead and graph this out. All right, so according to the new classical view, Everything's going to happen all the way up through the first 3 steps of the crowding out explanation, and that the government is going to have to borrow money to finance this expansionary fiscal policy or spend more. So the demand for investment is going to increase, right? But instead of increasing the interest rate, which is what the classical economists say will happen, the new classical economists say that as soon as people get those stimulus checks from the government that they've just borrowed from the banks, then people are going to take those stimulus checks and put them right into their savings account because they know the government's going to ask for that money back in the future. In other words, that supply of savings is going to increase just as much as the demand for borrowing is going to increase. So call it supply of savings too. And when that happens, then the interest rate isn't going to change at all. Right? All that's going to happen is that you have more money stuck in the banks because the government borrowed it from the banks and then people put it right back into the banks. Right? So you have more borrowing, but you also have more savings, right? And at the same time, the interest rate hasn't really changed at all. Right? So you're not going to have all those crowding out effects of lower consumption, lower investment, and lower net exports, but you're also not going to have any additional consumption or stimulus there that's going to boost us out of that recession. Right, simply because people are just going to put that money right back into those banks, right? So again, it's not going to stimulate the economy. It's not necessarily going to slow the economy down either. Nothing's going to happen except again maybe having some more money stuck into those banks, right? So again, the new classical view basically says that this expansionary fiscal policy will not work out nearly as well as the Keynesians think it will, because again, people will just save that money rather than spend it, or again, won't stimulate aggregate demand there. So there are 2 different schools of thought now as to why this Keynesian view of expansionary fiscal policy won't work. There's the classical school of thought that says it won't work because of crowding out. And then there's the new classical school, which says it won't work because of the Ricardian equivalence. Right. So with that in mind, make sure you can kind of separate out the Keynesian, classical, and new classical view of what to do when we're in a recession. Right. Or why, again, this expansionary fiscal policy, or how this expansionary fiscal policy will affect the economy when we are in a recession. If you are Keynesian, you think it's going to work to pull us out of the recession. If you are classical, you think it won't work because of crowding out. If you're new classical, you think it won't work because of the Ricardian equivalence. Now, it should be noted that the Keynesian economists themselves were worried about this idea of the people saving too much. Right? Keynes had this thing that he called the paradox of thrift. And the way the paradox of thrift works is it says that when a lot of people drastically increase their savings and reduce consumption, then it might cause total savings in the long run to decrease because the economy will stay down or won't be stimulated. So according to the Keynesian idea here, right, if people throw all their money in the banks, right, and start saving in anticipation of these bad times, then the economy will never lift itself out of this recession. Because remember, according to the Keynesians, it's the spending that's important, right? Remember, demand creates supply. If people aren't spending money, nobody's going to be producing anything. So if everybody's saving, then nobody's spending. If nobody's spending, then no businesses are going to thrive, and then we're no longer going to be able to hire individuals. People are going to be laid off and lose their jobs, and that's going to give them less money to both spend and save in the future. So a huge increase in savings now is going to lead to less total savings later when people start losing their income because they're no longer employed. So that's kind of the way that the paradox of thrift works. Now, classical economists might not believe in the paradox of thrift as much because, again, they think that people respond to economic calculation. So with that in mind, we got to go back to the loanable funds market to talk about how these schools of thought are a little bit different. So remember, if you are a classical economist, you say, well, if people start dumping money into banks because of these recessions, that's going to increase the supply of savings. And when the supply of savings goes up, that's going to cause a quantity of savings and investment to go up. And that's going to cause interest rates to go down because banks don't need to offer as high interest rates anymore due to the fact that people are saving so much money. Banks are like, look, we already have a bunch of money because people have been saving so much, so we're going to start offering lower interest rates. Right? We don't need to entice people to put their money in the banks nearly as much as we used to. Now, according to this classical view of what's going to happen, When those interest rates go down, then now people aren't going to be as eager to save as much, so they're going to start spending more. They're also going to start borrowing more money from the bank for the purposes of investment. So that consumption investment is going to increase, and that's going to help stimulate the economy. So again, remember the classical view says that people do respond to economic calculation, right, and that prices are flexible. So these interest rates will go down when we increase our savings. And when interest rates go down, people will respond to that by consuming and investing more. Now, I remember why Keynes thought this paradox of thrift would happen, or kind of their rebuttal to this idea, and that is that interest rates, just like all prices, are sticky, right? They might not necessarily go down, and even if they were to go down, people might not respond because people aren't these economic robots that respond to economic calculation in that way, right? So in other words, because interest rates are sticky and because people don't necessarily respond to economic calculation, even if they were to go down, then the economy might continue to stay down because people won't consume and invest more, even if those interest rates were to drop. Right? Remember, he said that people respond to animal spirits, which is another way of saying that people kind of act based off of their impulses or what they think is going to happen based on kind of a feeling or optimism or pessimism. And if we're in a recession, right, even if interest rates were to go down, people might continue to save money in fear that they're not going to have enough money in the future to smooth out their consumption cycles. In other words, people's pessimism during a recession could trump their desire to consume or invest more due to the fact that interest rates were to go down, if they do go down at all. So because of sticky interest rates and because people are still so pessimistic about the economy, right, Keynes said that this wouldn't necessarily happen, or this wouldn't necessarily happen, and therefore the economy would stay down. And that's why people would have less money to spend and save in the future as they start losing their jobs or start getting laid off. And so that's what we mean by the paradox of thrift. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and try a practice question from the first part here of this particular chapter, see if we understand how this stuff works. So let's go back to that idea of the crowding out effect. Right, so it says here that the crowding out effect indicates that budget deficits is that A, will stimulate aggregate demand and therefore exert a strong impact on output and employment, or B, will lead to additional borrowing and higher interest rates that will reduce the level of private spending. Is it C, lead to less borrowing and lower interest rates that will reduce the level of private spending, or D, are highly appropriate when the threat of a recession is present. So looking at a question like this, right, if you are Keynesian, then you might say that the answer is A or D, right? You'd agree on both of those. However, when we're talking about the crowding out effect, remember that's the classical school of thought. So whenever you hear crowding out, that's what the classical economists think. Remember that classical economists think that this expansionary fiscal policy that creates these budget deficits will not necessarily stimulate the economy, right? And therefore isn't the answer when it comes to how to pull us out of a recession, right? Remember, they think that because the government is running these budget deficits, that they're going to have to borrow more, not less, and that borrowing is what's going to lead to higher interest rates that will reduce the level of private spending. So B is the answer that you are looking for, right, in this particular question, right? Again, when it comes to those increased budget deficits, government's going to have to borrow money. That's going to jack up the interest rates. Those higher interest rates cause consumption and investment to go down. It also causes capital inflows to go up, which causes the dollar to appreciate, and the dollar appreciating is going to cause those net exports to go down. Right, so that is the first part here of Chapter 12 as to why, again, this Keynesian prescription of expansionary fiscal policy might not work out as well as we thought. We're going to continue on in the next lecture video here talking about why it might not work out as well as we thought, by talking about the political incentives that discretionary fiscal policy tends to create. Right, but with that in mind, that is enough for now. So just let me know if you have any questions about anything that we talked about in this video. Again, you can shoot me that email or come visit me in those Zoom office hours, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Right. But yeah, the next video I think is going to be a little bit more interesting. We're going to start talking about debt and deficit and stuff like that. So if you're concerned about the national debt, then the next video is one that you're definitely going to want to pay attention to. But until then, just let me know if you need anything, and take care.